it's great to present in this audience, to this audience and this department. And again, also thank you to the organizers, and thank you, David, for the invitation to this. And so I'll get started and just trust that if something goes wrong, somebody can let me know. And I'm just trying to get my laser pointer up. Okay, well, I'll start out by thanking my funding sources, and I will also start out by showing off the very diverse range of backgrounds of the individuals that I work with to do my research. I'm going to focus on these individuals here for today. And what I'm generally interested in is the relationship between motor commands sent by the nervous system and the mechanical behavior of limbs. And by behavior, what I'm really interested in is a set of behaviors. So all possible ways to do a behavior. So there's many ways you can do a behavior. There's many ways you can run. You can run fast or slow or uphill, downhill. You can run efficiently, inefficiently, and so on. So given that, is there also a set of motor commands that corresponds to those behaviors and would predict those behaviors? Well, to address that, we could do a simple thought experiment. We could say, okay, well, let's pretend we have a rocket ship and we take a frog and we go up into our rocket ship into space. We release the frog and we ask, can the frog swim in space? It turns out we don't have to do that thought experiment because somebody did it for real. And it turns out the answer is no, frogs cannot swim in space. And it's because the brain of the frog is expecting there to be physical resistance from the physical environment, some environmental feedback force. And so in absence of that, in this profoundly novel mechanical environment, those relationship between those motor commands and the behavior no longer makes sense. They're no longer valid. In other words, the relationship between motor commands and behavior depends on the mechanical environment, and we can't always expect a one-to-one correspondence. So that sets me up to talk about the components of the system that interest me. So if I think of musculoskeletal anatomy as a set of all of those musculoskeletal anatomical properties, and also there's the nervous system, of course, that produces the motor commands that activate the muscles, and the muscles produce force that pull on the skeleton, and the endpoint of the skeleton, the endpoint of the limb, either the hand or the foot, for example, pushes against the environment. So if you're trying to walk, your foot is pushing against the ground and the ground is pushing back. And that pushback force is the environmental reaction force. And the reason why it's shown as this kind of implicit feedback loop is because that force dictates or helps to dictate how fast the muscles contract. So case in point, let's say if I tried to push against a wall and that wall was very heavy, what would happen is my muscles under that high loading would move slowly, and I would push myself back. My center of mass would travel backwards. Whereas if that wall were very light and made out of paper, my muscles would now contract very quickly, throwing my arms forward, and my center of mass would travel forward. The point being here, and this is crucial, is that behavior is not necessarily the outcome of motor commands per se, but rather it is a byproduct of the interaction between this environmental feedback force and the muscles. And that's poorly understood. So in a nutshell, what I'm interested in is how anatomy and physical forces from the environment impact the relationship between motor commands and behavior. And ultimately, also I'm interested in considering sensory motor feedback, but I'm not going to talk about that today, at least not very much. So a lot of the work I'm going to talk about today is motivated by an interest in understanding how anatomical changes over the course of evolution, but also changes in the physical environment over the course of evolution, impact locomotor function. So an example of this would be the transition from fish to tetrapods, from sea to land. You have anatomical transition from fins to limbs, but also you have a transition of the physics from fluid dynamics to solid ground. But evolution is just a process. So we could be interested in other processes that affect anatomy. So that's kind of the course of my current and future work. So in general, I'm interested in how these changes, whether they are due to evolution or age or whatever, changes in the system affect changes in motor commands to affect a certain set of behaviors. And this is difficult because we have to start to understand the internal forces of the muscles, which are hard to measure, and the external forces, which are also hard to measure. And so to set all of this up, I'm going to just very briefly show you a couple slides of my earlier research to set us up for what I want to talk about. So a long time ago, during my PhD, I did this experiment where I put these swimming frogs in a tank, and inside the limb, I inserted sensors so I could measure the muscle force of the calf muscle and the shortening and lengthening of the muscle, but also the commands from the nervous system. This is the electromyography signal, the EMG, that tells when the nervous system is turning the muscles on and off. And what I wanted to do is observe the changes in behavior, the changes in swimming speed, and correlate those to changes in the motor command. And I used statistics and found that there's a significant correlation. The p-value is less than 0.05. So I could crudely predict swimming performance by looking at the motor commands from the nervous system. And yay, that was great. They stamped my thesis. But then, later on, I start to worry, okay, this is r squared equals 0.51, which means that's only half of the variation in behavior that motor commands are describing. In other words, I'm missing half the story. And so I started to think more and more about the effect of this environmental reaction force that I talked to you about and how that might be influencing things. And so to investigate that, I went on to the Royal Institute. And in order to start to understand this interaction between muscle forces and external forces, you have to measure them both. We know how to measure muscle force. Well, we can extract the muscle from the animal, fix it at one end, and attach the other end to this lever, which measures force. And then we can stimulate the muscle, making the muscle feel like it's attached to the nervous system, and measure the force. Okay, we can measure muscle force, but how do we measure the force external to the animal? Well, we could build a physical model of the animal. In this case, just a physical model of the flapping foot of a frog foot through the water. So when we stimulate the muscle, it generates force, and it's transmitted in real time to a command signal to the robot. And the robot, if the physical resistance of the fluid is high, then under that commanded muscle force, it moves a little bit. But if there's only a little bit of resistance, it moves a lot. And so that displacement information at each time step is transmitted back to the muscle to update muscle length, such that the muscle feels like it's moving the robotic foot. It feels the forces felt by the robotic foot, and the robotic foot feels the forces of the muscle through this closed loop system. And so we can change the properties of the foot, essentially change the loading, the environmental loading on the foot, and see how that affects how the muscle behaves without considering changes in the motor command. And so this is just a demo of what the system looks like. My finger just moving back and forth on this muscle lever, and I'm actuating the fin and feeling the forces without this direct connection. This is also a reminder for PhD students and early postdocs. You should think about the Royal Institute as an opportunity because it's a very nice place to do a fellowship. So in this experiment, we took a pair of muscles and contracted them reciprocally. And we can measure the work and power to swim this robotic fin. This robotic fin is swimming towards us. And here's another view of that. And so again, we're keeping the motor command constant, but we're changing the parameters of the foot, in this case, the foot flexibility. and we're seeing how that impacts performance. And so we ended up finding that there's essentially equivalent. The changes in motor commands and the changes in the physical environment are of equal importance. So that was kind of what we found out through these experiments. So with that setup, I'm going to move on to talking about terrestrial locomotion and the current work. So the goals for this talk are to introduce to you methods for studying the versatility of limbs and establish that frogs are appropriate for this. And I'll start by defining versatility, which I would say is a large feasible force set. In other words, you can produce force with your limb in many different directions. So if we consider the leg, so the foot can produce force in many different directions. That means it's versatile. That means that the foot can move in many different directions. But that also means that the foot is robust. It can maintain the same movements even when the environment changes. Say, for example, you're walking along a straight path. Your foot needs to be able to produce forces kind of forwards and backwards. But if there's a huge gust of wind that tries to blow you over, you need to be able to produce lateral forces to maintain your position and maintain your straight walking. So that allows you to be able to be robust, to be able to withstand different forces in novel situations. So as an outline, I'm going to talk about behavioral variation as a model for versatility, and then discuss computational techniques towards that, followed by experimental techniques, and then finally applications. So now I'll get into the meat of the talk by starting to ask, well, why is anatomy so complex? If we look at the hip bone of the frog, there is an insane number of muscles that act on the hip, that move the femur around. Why is it so complex? Well, we see in the evolutionary history of frogs, early on, there's an increased number of femoral muscles corresponding to this massive diversification, massive number of different species doing different diverse things, all different locomotor behaviors. So it makes sense to think that the more muscles you have, the more behaviors you're capable of doing, but I want to be more precise than that. What muscles are required for a behavior, and what additional muscles would be required to vary that behavior? So these are not questions that I'm going to answer for you today, because it's the current project of one of my PhD students. So I'm going to move on to the first part of the talk, and the conceptual model is rapid coordinated limb extension. So that would include behaviors like reaching, like throwing, or the launch phase of jumping. So I'm thinking in very general terms here. And my study model is this red-legged running frog, which is actually a great jumper, Cassina maculata. And the approach for this first part will be to use video to record the behavior and try to understand and observe the variability in behavior, and then relate that versatility to anatomy. So we did this by setting up a lot of video cameras and mirrors. And this is a really nice frog to work with, but these are tricky experiments because these are kind of essentially tree frogs. So we set up this arena with cameras and wires and stands and lights. And so the frog thinks, well, I'm in a forest, so it just jumps. And if you're not looking carefully, it'll end up on one of the wires or one of the cameras. But eventually we get it to do some behavior in front of the cameras. And we essentially glue these markers on the frog in a way that we can easily remove them later to essentially do motion capture. So we're observing the same events from different angles, and we can do reconstruction, a spatial reconstruction, and basically from these landmarks, reconstruct a stick figure of the frog. So hopefully this kind of looks like a frog to you. So we have these stick figures of the frog now in 3D, which we can rotate around and address questions, help us address questions more directly. So we observed these frogs jumping along this massive range of behavior, from jumping pretty much horizontally to jumping nearly vertically, which is very impressive. So we wanted to understand, well, how do the frogs modulate all the various joints in their legs to modulate how much they go up versus how much they go forward to control their jump trajectory? Wasn't a straightforward thing to explore. The leg movements are deceptively simple. They're actually very complicated because there are so many joints. And so can I gain intuition by thinking about how joint angles relate to overall motion of the body? So what I did was something that I do a lot of times, is I kind of make this little game. I don't know if this is going to play. But anyway, this is just a video of me trying to interactively change the joint angles and explore how that impacts how this frog is oriented. And a short answer is it's extremely frustrating to try to work in joint angle space and try to think out how individual joint angles influence movement, because there's so many angles to consider. So how do we deal with this complexity problem? We can borrow from ideas from robotics theory, which thinks not only in terms of joint angles. So in robotics theory, it's often a thought about parameters to describe a joint. What are the parameters? Well, one parameter is the joint angle. Another parameter is the rotation axis, which is an imaginary pin about which the joint rotates. So if I just take a picture of myself and think about my elbow in this position, there's an imaginary joint axis of rotation here and an imaginary joint axis here at the wrist. And so if I extend these joints, my elbow is going to go this way and my hand is going to also go this way. But if I change my hand axis, my wrist axis, to be horizontal, it's going to make the wrist move this way. So long story short is the joint axis of rotation gives you information about how the joint moves, how the joints move the limb overall. So that was our first clue. So it turns out frogs have very complex joint rotation axes. So this is a rear view of the frog, and these blue lines represent kind of the pins through those rotation axes. And so they're all at weird angles, and also they change during the jump. So the angle of these, the orientation of these rotation axes indicate how that given joint affects the overall motion of the frog limb and the frog body. And what we found was that the orientation of these rotation axes actually converges to a common angle towards the end. You can kind of see them aligning here, hopefully. And as they get more horizontal, it turns out that's what causes the frog to jump more steeply. So it's really the angle of these rotation axes that govern the trajectory of the frog. So we thought about this for a long time and kind of came up with a theoretical model or a template about how the frog kind of controls its trajectory. And we think that there's this simple underlying template that is, which I'll go into in a second, which is modified slightly to give diverse behaviors. And this is based on the control of the axes of rotation. So it turns out you can look at a very horizontal jump and a frog walking, and the motions of the kinematics look very similar. So we came up with this theoretical coordination template, this way of controlling that the nervous system might control the limb at a high level, which is orient the most distal segment of the limb, which would be the body, orient that towards the target, and then extend the legs using the least amount of rotation necessary. And implicitly, what that ends up being is a control algorithm where you're controlling the orientation of the rotation axes. So when you're trying to control the limb in the space of rotation axes, to control the trajectory, it's actually very easy to control the limb. This is a little game I made, which I can control the motions of the frog using this little joystick here, controlling the turning, the upwards motions, and whatnot. And this very theoretical model looks very similar to how real frogs move and how they modulate their motions. And I should also say it's kind of cool that when we looked at turning, which is not something we observed experimentally, the changes in joint angles are so subtle, they probably wouldn't have been able to be recognized or discerned within the experimental noise. So it's very useful to be doing these kinematics models. So the remaining question is, how does the limb maintain similar motions across different mechanical situations? So we move on to the second part of the talk. And here we started out with these very detailed medical scans, these enhanced micro CT scans that are enhanced contrast, so you can see the soft tissues as well as hard tissues. And from these, they painstakingly rebuilt or made a digital version of the frog, which is pretty cool. So you can digitally dissect this frog, and then they combined this with the motion capture data, and then animated this digital skeleton so that we have not only the motions of the bones, but the motions of the muscles as well. So we can use that to test how all of those all those various muscles in the leg relate to the versatility of jumping. So we're going to get into versatility or feasibility theory. So I'm going to consider now forces in the action sense, which means as the ground is here, and just pardon me, I've ignored the hands of the frog. They are important, but I'm ignoring them here. So the foot is pushing against the ground, and if the frog wants to jump up and to the left, it has to produce a force that goes down and to the right. So we acknowledge the fact that there's muscles inside, and we have those inside our model. So here is one muscle. So if that muscle were maximally activated by the nervous system, then this would be the direction and magnitude of force produced at the foot. So we do that for all of the other 48 or so muscles in the leg and the pelvis, and we get essentially all of these different possible force directions, and we do like kind of a kitchen wrap, shrink wrap around it. It's called a convex hull around it, and we can get what's called the feasible force space or feasible force set. So this is a visualization of all of the possible magnitudes and directions that a frog foot can generate given all of these muscles. And it's dependent on posture because the moment arms of these muscles are dependent on posture, but also that accounts for the relationship between joint angles and the transmission of force via the Jacobian, if you like that sort of thing. So this is a way to quantify versatility. The breadth of this feasible force space tells us something about the versatility of the limbs. So that's a theoretical boundary, feasible force space, FFS. So this is a busy slide, but essentially it's going to show you what happens through time. So we have a top view, a back view, and a side view. And I'm just going to animate that. And as the frog jumps, you can see it changing shape. And I'll summarize what happens for you. Essentially, early on, the feasible force space is elongated from side to side, which means the frog has scope to turn, but not so much scope to move forwards and backwards. And you can think that's ecologically relevant. When the frog is just sitting on a leaf, it doesn't know where a predator is going to come from. So it makes sense that it should be able to produce force to the side as well. But as the frog is extending its legs, kind of the opposite happens. It becomes more elongated. It has less scope to move side to side and more scope to move forwards and backwards, giving it more power to kind of carry on its acceleration on its current trajectory. And it's kind of stabilizing in a way because it makes it less able to produce force from side to side as it's really going through that high acceleration part of the mid jump. So we can also look at the contributions of individual muscles. So an individual muscle can be in this area. We would call it versatile because it would stretch. Let me start that again. So a muscle could be in this area. We would call that powerful because it might stretch the feasible force space without broadening. So it gives it more power. That would be like kind of like elongating it. Whereas you could have another muscle up here that would broaden the feasible force space, but without stretching it. So it would give it more versatility. So I'm going to compare two different muscles. This muscle, which is impossible to pronounce, so I'm not going to try. This hip muscle, which is very important in the early evolution of frogs. It appeared very early in the evolution. And then this other muscle here. So this muscle here is a muscle that when it contracts, it increases the versatility of the limb. Whereas when this muscle contracts, it increases the power of the limb. And we can look at how these things kind of change through time, which is way more complex than I have to go into currently. So now we know exactly what questions we need to know, want to ask and what techniques to use. Why is anatomy so complex? Well, we want a large feasible space. What additional muscles do we need for behavioral variation? Well, it's the pelvic muscles which give us that extra breadth of the feasible force space. So the next step is to try to do these kind of numerical ablation experiments where we take away certain muscles and we see how that impacts the feasible force space, how that impacts how versatile the limbs are. So these are some of the things that my current PhD student is probably going to get into in the coming years. So we'll move on to the third part of the talk and really start to think about this environmental part, the environmental reaction force. So we're going to consider vertical jumping because it's much easier to model. So now what's been done here is we've modeled this frog inside a real-time simulator called Majoko. And the frog, I hope this looks like a frog to you. So this is the body, and we've glued the two legs together into one leg. And so we can deal with it. It's one hip extensor, one knee extensor, one ankle extensor. And Majoko's cool because it's got an artificial ground and it mimics the physics of ground contact. So now what we want to do is we want to see how muscle-limb interactions depend on substrate. In other words, what the limb is pushing off of. Towards the ultimate goal, which we're not going to do in this talk, but ultimately we'd love to know how frogs are able to manage to jump off different substrates like this blade of grass or hardwood or a lily pad on water. So how do we test those things? Well, my former graduate student developed this technique called reverse haptics, and I'm going to show you how it works. So it starts out with a planar manipulator, a simple robotic arm. And this is going to sound strange for a few minutes, but just stick with me and it'll all hopefully make sense. So what matters here is not what this arm looks like. This is not supposed to look anything like a frog. Only what matters is what happens here. So now at the same time we have this simulation, and he's programmed this so that the robotic arm moves in such a way so that the tip of the arm moves exactly how the tip of the toes of the simulation move. So if you go into the computer and you move the mouse around, you can drag this simulation around and the robot's going to follow. At least this part of the robot's going to follow wherever the toes of the simulation go. And so you have to be careful, because if you make it go through the virtual ground, then the robot's going to crash, with all of its power through into the real ground and destroy itself. So why in the world would we want to do that? Well, it's all about the fact that we have a load cell that measures force. It measures ground contact force and applies that as a point force at the tip of the toes. And so I'm going to first show you a simulation in virtual reality without any robot involved. And so it's pushing against the simulated ground, generating ground reaction force, which is illustrated by that light blue line. And all these lines just indicate to you the activations to the muscle and the muscle force. So it jumps in a well-behaved way. But then when we take away the ground, of course, it's kind of like the frogs in space thing, where the frog just kind of flails around and just falls. So it needs that physical contact. So now what I'm going to show you is we're going to run the simulation in this mode where there's no ground in the simulation. The only thing in the simulation is the simulated frog. The ground is in real life. So through this feedback system, as soon as we press go, the simulated body starts sinking down due to gravity, and this robotic joint follows that sinking, sinks down into the ground, comes into contact with whatever arbitrary surface we put it on, measures the force, and in real time applies that force to the toes of the simulation. So the simulation is feeling the force from the real world. And this robot is feeling the force from the internal musculature of the simulation. So we have this, again, this closed loop setup, and we can have it jump on various substrates. And again, we don't have to worry about the complicated physics of arbitrarily weird substrates. And just as kind of a proof of concept that we published here, it's really interesting that this jumping performance is robust to surfaces with very different mechanical properties. Essentially, the jump height is the same, but the internal work required to do that is different. So there's no controller here. And all the motor commands are exactly the same. And the system is robust. And I don't have time to go into this, but essentially it's because of the internal properties of the muscle and how the muscle reacts. Gives us this kind of self-stability. So where to go from here? Well, now we have the ability to alter anatomy in software. So we can do this directly now. And we can alter environment in hardware. So someday, when I have more funding to do this in the future, we can do things like we can replay evolutionary steps and change the anatomy. We can also use more complex anatomy. We can copy and paste this complex model into our simulator and test what is the interaction between the complexity of the musculoskeleton and its robustness in its ability to deal with different substrates. So these are really exciting things that we want to eventually look at. So on to the final part now, and I'll just take a quick sip of tea. Does everything make sense so far while I'm sipping my tea? Does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, we can take some quick questions. Anyone wants to ask a quick question on this, while Chris is refreshed. So we'll wait. You might have caught people by surprise with your question for early questions, Chris. So we might have
that's
to.
Okay. Yeah, I just needed to sip my tea, so that just bought me time.
So there's a question, Andrea, do you want to ask a question quickly for Chris?
Yeah, just a very quick question. I think that the robotic arm with the software simulation is very cool. And I was wondering, when you initiate the simulation and the robotic arm drops on the floor, say, what weight do you begin with? Is it a weight that is comparable to the one that you had set in the simulation, or do you just get the full weight of the robotic arm and then jump from there?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So it is the weight of the arm is totally irrelevant. It is the weight of the simulation. And this is something that is a little bit hard to explain because the robot is actually controlled kinematically. Its position is controlled. And so the simulation is essentially solving, it's integrating, so it's solving the equations of motion based on the mass of the simulation. So if it's just a mass falling in space, then it's solving the acceleration due to gravity. So based on the software mass that we put in there, it's going to integrate that and give us an instantaneous update to the position for the robot. So the robot falls as if it's a mass of a certain amount in software. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Basically, your robot arm follows whatever the simulation is doing. So it would be following the weight in the simulation. Okay, makes sense.
Exactly.
Great. I've seen more questions, but we just keep them for later, Chris, and we let you finish your talk first.
Sure. Okay, cool. Thanks for the question. All right, I'll carry on then. So now, I really was before motivated by evolution. And again, I said that's a process, one of many processes that can affect the system. But how does age affect the system? And that's very new that we're looking at right now, or at least new for us. And so we're interested in changes in the musculoskeletal anatomy, for example, changes to the stiffness of connective tissue, and how changes in the mechanical system with age, how they might require changes in sensor motor feedback. So before I get into the details of that, I need to introduce to you one more technique, and which relates to the fact that we need to start really understanding force, how muscle force is generated, and how it interacts with the skeleton. So if we wanted to measure force in vivo, it's very difficult to do, but let's say we wanted to do this inside this walking frog, and we had one of these leg muscles. Well, we could record how the muscle is shortening and lengthening through time. We could also stick some EMG electrodes in and get a record of how the nervous system is turning on and off the muscles. And then we could isolate the muscle and fix it at one end like we did before, attach the nerve to a stimulation electrode, make the muscle feel like it's still attached to the nervous system, and we replay the stimulation pattern into the muscle. And then we also attach the muscle to this motorized lever, moving the muscle along this shortening and lengthening pattern, making the muscle feel like it's inside the mechanical limb, moving around. And so if all those conditions are set up well, and if we knew these things a priori, then we could measure force in vitro that is the same as what would have been produced in vivo. So it's a way of estimating in vivo force using in vitro methods. And that was a profound advance to muscle physiology back in the 80s. But if I want to test evolutionary questions, so what happens if the anatomy changes? Well, this technique is not really appropriate, because if the anatomy changes in some way that we haven't tested yet, it's going to change the stimulation patterns and the length change patterns in a way that we wouldn't be able to predict, because we don't know the forces. So this is an explanatory but not a predictive tool. So it's a useful tool for other things, but not for what we wanted to do, because we can't change the anatomy in this model. So how we tried to solve that problem is we decided to, of course, use another closed feedback loop. So what we're going to try to do now is put a model of the frog inside of the electronics and have the muscle basically power a simulation of a jumping frog. So we have a essentially the force signal coming from the muscle, and it gets sent to that same simulation engine I talked to you about before. And there's a very simplistic model of a jumping frog inside that engine. And so the force goes in to the imaginary muscles, the simulated muscles. So the simulation applies the same amount of force that was recorded by the software, by the hardware, and then integrates the equation, updates the joints accelerate, and updates the length changes to update the length change in real life. So the effect is when this real muscle, in vitro muscle, contracts, it feels like it's inside of a limb. And so this is what the limb looks like. It's very simplistic. Again, this is the two legs glued together, hip, knee, and ankle joints. This section looks ridiculous because frog bodies are very big. So again, no arms, so apologies for that. But here's the hip joint and the knee joint. Hip and knee joint are kind of pre-programmed. And then, but it's the ankle joint which is of interest to us for this particular experiment. So what we did was we have a kind of a placeholder in simulation, kind of a cable inside the simulation spanning the ankle joint. And so what happens is when the real muscle contracts, it sends that force value into the simulation, and that force value is applied along this cable. And that's how it works. And then the simulation engine integrates the equation, and the joint extends, and then this cable shortens, and then the muscle is made to shorten as well. So the muscle feels like it's inside the simulation. And again, the hip and the knee are pre-programmed, but the ankle is controlled by the muscle. And so we can do things like we can mess around with the motor stimulation of the muscle, but we can also mess around with the anatomy. And so that's the whole point. We want to be able to change the anatomy of our simulation and see how that impacts the behavior. Here's a close-up of it. So here's just a kind of a schematic of the closed loop setup. And so here is a very early pilot run, which kind of looks like a lame jump. The frog doesn't end up going anywhere. But we're super excited because here's the muscle contracts and it makes the frog jump. And so this is the electrical stimulation to the in vitro muscle. So this is a real muscle. And we're measuring the muscle force and the muscle length change. And these experiments are really fun because we have no idea what's going to happen. And the jump happens so fast, we can't see it. We have to animate it in hindsight, kind of after the fact. So I'll explain why that's important in a second. So again, the whole point of doing this is so that, let's say we wanted to change the properties of the joints, or change the lengths of the leg segments, or change the mass of the body, we could directly manipulate that in software and see how that impacts the dynamics of muscle contraction. And again, we're looking precisely at the relationship between changes in anatomy and then the resultant required changes in motor stimulation to achieve the same behavior. So what we're going to do, ultimately, I'm just checking my time here, I'm going to end very soon. We're going to start studying reaching, which is very conceptually similar to jumping, as I've explained before. And essentially we have a simulation of a reaching arm and a simulation of sensory motor feedback inside of that. And so what we're finding with this simulation is it's extremely sensitive to the properties of the muscle. And we know that properties of muscle change with age. So what we're going to try to do is we use this, what I call in vitro virtual reality, what I showed you before, this thing here. We're going to use that to build a reaching simulation where we have muscles, real muscle tissue sitting in a dish that are controlling now not a frog, but a reaching arm, a simulation of a human reaching arm. that can do kind of a reaching task. But of course, it's going to be scaled down because we're going to use frog muscles to power this. And we can test to see how aging muscle properties require us to change the properties of the sensory motor feedback. So that's where we're headed. Again, this is what we're going towards. And so I'll end on this note that, you know, frogs aren't stupid. They're actually really smart. And like I said, you know, they're using the motor commands that that they kind of remembered from being in the water, but they're presented with this new novel environment. They can learn how to locomote. And the way to locomote is to push off of something. So I'll end with that, and also I like to also show some bloopers. When we do a lot of simulations, and simulations tend to fail. I don't know if this is going to play. That's okay. Oh, there we go. Simulations tend to fail, and so yeah, if you don't have conservation of energy, sometimes frogs can actually swim in space. So I'll end on that note. Thank you very much for listening, and happy to take whatever questions you have.
Well, thanks very much, Chris, on behalf of the entire audience. This was amazing, and I can't wait to see what happens with all this in the next 10 years, really, because, I mean, this has been so much detailed work that was required to actually make this work, and I think 10 years ago, if you would have said that that's what you're going to do, it would have been hard to believe that it's going to work. It is working, right? So this is amazing to see, and I'm sure there's many questions. If people who want to ask a question just raise their hand, then I'm very happy to just give them the opportunity to ask Chris a question. I saw there was one that I didn't have the opportunity to take when there was this. Yeah, there we go. Balind, go ahead.
Hello, Chris. Thank you for the really interesting presentation. This is a really, really cool project.
Oh, thank you.
I wanted to ask a bit about reverse haptics. Could you clarify or like point out the benefits of using that approach as opposed to simulating the surface properties inside the virtual environment itself?
Yeah, I would say if you can simulate it, it's always better to simulate it if you have a good model, because robotics, you know, in a model you can, you know, you don't have to deal with like friction and weird things like that. So if you have a good model for the physics, then by all means, definitely do the simulation and don't involve the robotics. But in our case, we want to move towards arbitrarily complex interactions. I mean, I think even fluid dynamics, you start thinking about weird fluid structure interactions and things like that. It safely goes beyond what we can do currently. Maybe in the future, I think it would be possible, but not right now. So now, actually, the easiest, when dealing with complex physics, it's a lot easier to use the robotics approach. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. And I guess it also makes a lot of sense to have that perspective if you want to use like robotics in real life controlled by virtual muscles.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, so it's just like the moral of the story is, you know, it's always, I think it's always better, try to simulate the thing that's well behaved.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Balind. Juan, I think you were next.
Let me try to. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Really nice talk, Chris. I have a lot of questions, but I guess we are talking later. But just a really quick question. I found your comment that, you know, basically it didn't, you know, the frogs can do this jumping feet forward in a way, like basically a joint and muscle properties let them get the same output regardless of the terrain. Yeah, which is fascinating. But I was thinking about bipedal creatures like us and the hand, right? The hand seems to me is like a very different problem, right? Because, you know, probably requires like is controlled from a nervous system perspective completely different, right? Which is why primates have like these dedicated descending pathways and so forth. But what about reaching? Because you're studying reaching, do you think reaching can be a bit like locomotion, and then the hand is something different? Do you think it's all the same and I'm complicating things? Like
okay, are you? Yeah, okay. In our reaching, I love like neglecting really important parts of anatomy. So, and our reaching model doesn't have the hand. But yeah, so I think so that kind of, I think you're right there. Ultimately, when, you know, down the road, when we have more complex models, when we're dealing with the hand, it is going to be more nuanced feedback in addition to the feed forward. In reaching, currently, at least it seems like what the evidence is saying is that the feed forward aspect of it is very important. So getting you almost there in kind of using that pre-programmed motion is super important. Unfortunately, that's the thing that breaks down with age. So yeah, feedback becomes more important towards the end of the reach. So I'm not sure if I'm getting at what you're asking, but essentially, yeah. Did I? Yeah, just
yeah. No, you did basically. Like I guess we can talk offline, but I guess from an evolutionary point of view, it makes sense to forget about the hand because you know only a handful of animals have hands that they use, right? So
I see what you're saying. Okay, so yeah, okay. So I think there is definitely a need to address this problem, like from a comparative perspective. So look at reaching lots of different animals. And actually, I'm really excited. I have an undergraduate student joining me in a couple of weeks, and she's going to start looking at frog reaching.
oh.
Yeah, we have some video data, and she's just going to try to analyze the video data of frogs basically reaching towards a stick perch as they're climbing. But eventually I want to look at reaching in a comparative context because you're right. You know, a lot of animals don't have the same kind of manipulation as we do. Frogs do have very good manipulation, but yeah. You know, there's certainly a lot of animals don't. So that's a really good, important, and interesting idea.
Okay, thanks so much. I guess we'll talk later.
Thank you.
Thanks, Juan. Charles, you're next. And if other people have questions, just keep up raising your hand so I can organize this. Charles, go ahead.
Thank you. I'm just not really familiar with all of this, but you mentioned briefly, Doctor, that vertical jumping is easier to model. I don't implicitly, instinctually know why. So could you expand on that?
Sure. Yeah. It's just, well, I could say, I'll give you two answers. I'll give you the bad answer first. So the real reason why it's easier for us is because we cheated, because we constrained the model to only be able to move along the vertical axis, just because it was, at least for this first implementation, it was too computationally difficult. So that's kind of the not helpful answer. But the real answer would be, the more general answer would be that essentially it's very difficult to control. You have rotations. Ultimately, what you want to do is have the center of mass move in a straight line, whether it's a diagonal or vertical or horizontal, but everything is rotating. So how do you make a bunch of rotating and counter-rotating parts with a lot of mass? How do you do that in a way that ends up getting you resolving to a kind of like, you know, a linear direction? And that turns out to be really hard. And so if you want to just jump vertically, it's, I don't want to say it's simpler, but I think there's just one less parameter you're dealing with. You're not dealing with the takeoff angle. The other way to look at it is if we were trying to simulate just normal jumping, then what would happen would be we would change the substrate, and the frog would basically be changing its takeoff angle, and sometimes it would jump backwards. And that's kind of not fair to the question that we're asking, because it's a failure if the frog jumps backwards, but it's kind of just a failure for reasons that we don't necessarily care about for that particular project, if that makes any sense, because we were just looking at how the substrate affects the interaction of the muscle and the substrate. Between the muscle and the substrate. Is that starting to make sense? It's essentially fewer parameters that you're modeling.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. I can definitely understand computational restrictions making, narrowing the problem down.
Yeah, and I also think the way that frogs are built, the way that they sit, if you just try to do a simulation without any learning, without any feedback, and just stimulate the muscles, just guessing on what those stimulations should be, I think the frog would tend to jump kind of vertically. I think it would eventually jump backwards, but it would kind of try to jump vertically. I think to manage to get the frog to move horizontally, it kind of has to move vertically first and then do this forward motion. So yeah, that would be worth considering theoretically at some point. Why is it harder to think about forward motion? But hopefully that answers your question, at least partly.
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks for the question, Charles. Chris, Angela had a question, but she had to disappear early, so I'm just was tasked to tell you that she's really looking forward to speaking to you tomorrow. I'm sure she will say something about hands and the omission of hands, which for a hand researcher is, of course, interesting for reaching tasks. But Fabi has another question for you.
All right. Hi, Chris. First of all, thank you so much for your talk. It was absolutely lovely.
Oh, thank you. Wow, thanks.
My question is a bit in terms of how you address aging. Is this rather about changes that you want to observe in the muscle itself, so deterioration over time or muscle fatigue after repeated activation? Or is this more a question about if you couple that again with perhaps a robotic system and you want to simulate things like joints that stiffen over time, or maybe a loss in bone mass? So which of the two are you addressing more directly there?
Yeah, for this project, it's directly the connective tissue inside the muscle is what we're interested in. So the stiffening of that is what we're interested in. But all those other things that you mentioned are important and could be considered in the future. So yeah, but for now, what we'd really love to do is get to a point where we have a parameter in software which controls the stiffness of the connective tissue, and we vary that and nothing else and see essentially how that might change the performance of reaching.
Right. Great, thank you very much.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you for the question.
Sorry. The seminar is officially over, but of course, if people still want to chat a little bit with Chris informally about his work, feel all free to stay. I have a question for you, Chris. It's sort of a bit of a conceptual one. In the beginning, or like if I think about the work that you showed, one thing that seems to be fundamentally different from a lot of research that has been done into this previously is really saying, well, fundamentally, sure, when we think of locomotion, we think of center of mass motion. And historically, it seems that people have basically then just focused on external forces, I think to some extent because that was just easier to measure than to look at internal forces. Now you're saying, well, we can't really decouple these two because the external forces arise from the internal motion. So we really have to try and tackle that. Do you think that that line of thought will permeate into all sorts of other areas of animal locomotion as well, and then really help us to understand a bit more about what's actually going on? And the sort of historical focus on external forces has neglected some of the key complexity that we really need to capture.
Yeah, I mean, I hope so. I hope it will. I don't. On the one hand, I don't want to say, I don't want to be the one to tell everybody, hey, look, what you were studying that you thought was really complex before is actually like way more complex. But I don't want to necessarily do that because I think it's really valuable to consider just the external forces, and you can use inverse dynamics to get you most of the way to understanding what the muscles are doing. And that's good enough actually for a lot of answering a lot of questions. So I think it really depends on how important it is. Depends on the question, and I think if you really want to understand what's limiting locomotion, I think then ultimately you do have to consider both, because you could say, okay, well, what's limiting? Well, cheetahs run really fast. What limits how fast they run? Ultimately, you do have to know like the power that a muscle is generating and whether or not that's hitting the rails of the power. Could be the muscle power. It could be bones. Could be the bones aren't. The bones might break if the muscles use their maximum. I mean, I don't know, but anyway, I guess it just depends on the question. But yeah, certainly if you want to really understand the mechanical limits, I think you do have to consider the muscles ultimately.